this Philippine human rights delegation here in Canada. The initiative is part of this whole UPR, or the Universal Periodic Review, that is actually going to happen at the UN this coming May and June 2012. The Universal Periodic Review is going to review the Philippines' performance in its adherence to human rights. In 2008, when the Philippines was reviewed under the UPR, the Philippine government enumerated a number of commitments and promises to improve its performance on, the issues of human rights. Now it's 2012, and the guests that we had here, Angie and Mary, and before that, Bishop Clamore from the United Church of Christ in the Bishop Marigsa from the United Church of Christ in the Philippines was also part of the delegation, talking about the human rights situation in the country and pleading for support, from the public, from the members of the parliament, from the churches, NGOs, and Canadians in general who advocates for human rights, that they need help to address the situation in the Philippines. In March 27th, they arrived in Canada, and from Toronto, we went to Ottawa, and we met with members of the parliament. We met with the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. One of the commitments made is the possibility of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights organizing a parliamentary delegation to the Philippines to look into these allegations of human rights violations. And we can only make that happen if, people on the ground would support us in pushing and reminding, their local members of the parliament to push for this to happen at the federal level.
It's a great honor to be able to join you today both to have our private meetings to talk about the ongoing problem, the ongoing outrage of human rights abuses in the Philippines, and the role that Canadian mining companies have been playing in creating situations that are an offense to the International Declaration for Human Rights, but without declarations and without charters, something that offends the human spirit, and that we are all joined together globally in the same vision and the same dream that we have a world without human rights abuse, where people are not, for their efforts, such as Dr. Mary's, to go help train people and help become, to help with the health care in remote areas, and for that to have been abducted by heavily armed military and thrown in jail for 10 months, or in Angie's case, to be for no reason other than her concern for farmers and indigenous peoples, to be put in jail for 6 years and tortured.
In 1986 and 87, that's the time that we first set up our community-based health programs in the Philippines. And these community-based health programs are actually small self-reliant health programs set up in remote barangays in order to take care of health services that were never provided by the government. And so these were intensive programs that worked from prevention up to actual care. And in my experience alone, we've been able to set up 16 health programs in 16 different villages in the areas I was working in. Now, that was just one program. Now, all over the country, there were similar initiatives from the north down to the south in Mindanao doing the same thing. And they were all under, all these efforts were being coordinated through a national program called the Council for Health and Development. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Clamore with us, who is from the Council for Health and Development.
Yes, you heard Dr. Chandu right. I'm a community doctor too. working with the NGO Council for Health and Development. Because for our friends here in Canada who doesn't know much of our country, right now we are about 100 million in population, and unemployment rate is so high, landlessness is still a problem, and of course healthcare. The government is not providing healthcare to the people, especially that they only allot 2% of our national budget to healthcare, and if we compute it, it only means that every Filipino receive 99 cents per day for healthcare. So it cannot even buy a paracetamol or pain reliever. But for those of us who choose to stay, it's not so easy. But because every day when we go to our community, especially in the far-flung areas, and we see the struggles of our kababayan, that even the food they eat, it's a problem for them. The land they till is a problem. We are inspired by their courage to go on and their unity despite of poverty and cooperation to struggle for their life and their land. Unfortunately too, in our country, if you go to the far-flung communities and doing some services, most of the development workers, members of the civil societies, human rights defenders are being tagged as members of the rebel group, because in the Philippines there is a civil war, there's the New People's Army and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front having war with our government because of the fundamental problems in our country, most especially rooted to economic problems, landlessness, and unemployment. That is why most of our colleagues are really experiencing human rights violations. In our case, we usually experience harassments whenever we go to communities because they won't let us in some communities because they would say, oh, there are New People's Army there. But we have to go to communities to give services. The government does not really provide them with services they need. The most brutal thing they did to us was when we were having a training on February 6, 2010 in a small farmhouse in a suburban area in Rizal. It's just near Manila, the capital. Some 300 in full battle-geared military men and police swept into the house where we were staying. Immediately, they put the guns on our head, blindfolded us, and handcuffed us one by one. Then we were brought to a military camp where we experienced so much human rights violations. We were deprived of sleep for 2 days, made to admit their accusations. We were made to hear gunshots and unnerving screams of people who we suppose are being hurt. We were incommunicado for 6 days, and we only saw our lawyers after 6 days. So, they filed false charges against us of illegal possession of firearms and explosives. They allege us of being bomb makers. So, to justify their arrests and our continued detention, so we have to stay in the military camp for 3 long months, where every day, mostly during the night or even in odd hours of the day, we were taken out of our cell. We were solitarily confined. And they would blindfold us and handcuff us and do some more interrogations and threatenings. They would tell us that they would hurt our family if we don't admit that we are rebels. They would kill us. They dug a hole, our graves, and we will be the next one to be buried. We were sexually harassed, subjected to indignities, and we don't have privacy. We don't have access to any communication other than a daily 10 to 15 minutes visit from our families. And they have to go all the way from Manila to that camp, which takes them 4 hours to go every day, just to make sure we are still there and alive. So our families are also not spared from harassments. Even our lawyers were not spared from that. They were also threatened. We were transferred to an ordinary jail facility after 3 months because we filed a petition to be transferred. We're not supposed to be in a military camp where we are vulnerable to so many harassments. And they don't want to release us and transfer us, so we have to do a 2-week fasting along with our families and supporters. So after 3 months, we were transferred, and it was a 7 months, a little better than, of course, in the military, in the hands of the military, because we were able to receive visitors, and we were aware of how the public, the local and international communities have been supporting the call for our release. So it was 10 months of a very rigid campaign outside the jail and inside the jail. And the most touching for us are patients coming all over the country from other areas with their little children, visiting us and telling the jail guards that, oh, you should release them. They are our doctors. We don't have anyone with us to take care of us. So after 10 months, the president was pressured to order the Department of Justice to withdraw the case against us, seeing the merits of the case. It was illegal arrest and torture. So we were freed on December of 2010. Thanks to all of the people who supported us, including so many Canadians who prayed for us, who send us letters, and do so many actions for our release. But it's not yet over, because the perpetrators of human rights violations are still out there, continuing to violate the rights of the people back in our hometown. During the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, we have 1,200 extrajudicial killings, more than 200 disappearances, and and tortures and forced evacuations, illegal arrests, but no one was held accountable. And it's really frustrating that this government does not really help us in seeking justice, and now they're the ones preventing us from getting it, probably cuddling all those human rights violators. That's why the violations continue to happen in this government. We have, in 2 years in power of the present President Benigno Aquino, we have 68 extrajudicial killings, 9 disappearances, 55 tortures, and so many evacuations, forced evacuations in the mining areas. We are survivors, and we won't be victims for long, because we are doing everything in our power of course, taking this time to tell our friends and the world that we have to do something. And we thank you for supporting the Philippines in so many ways. And when we go home next week, we will bring all the hope that these human rights violations will end, because we will work hand in hand with all the people around the world. Thank you.
I'm Angie Bisunya Ipong. I come from a peasant family, but I'm also a teacher by profession. So I taught for several years, about 4 years, but later I joined the Mission Society of the Philippines, and I found myself working with the sugar cane workers of Negros. You know, for more than 40 years of my life, I was working with the farmers and the indigenous people. One day, I was having a meeting with peasant leaders, especially women, International Women's Day, March 8, 2005, when a group of armed men, not in uniform but with long arms, they came into the room. We were not yet starting our meeting, but they went into the place where I was lying down because we were not starting yet, and then they took me. And then they handcuffed me. I said, no, let me change, because I was not in a proper... no, never mind. They dragged me, handcuffed me, and brought me to the van. Then in the van, they blindfolded me, so I could not see anything anymore. I don't know where they were bringing me. Anyway, they brought me from camp to camp. They brought me to one camp. They were interrogating me, and then asking me all kinds of questions, but what would I say? I said, I want to go to your officer. But anyway, after 4 days, I was incommunicado. No, I had no lawyer, no right to counsel. I was not visited, although they were trying to visit me, but they were denied my visit. They always told them, she's not here. So denied a visit. So anyway, they brought me after 4 days. They put me in a helicopter and brought me to another camp. And there, that was where I experienced the most terrible order in my life. First, these were different groups. First, they were beating my head with a thickly rolled paper, and then they were punching my shoulders and my hips. And then, the worst thing they did to me, they started to undress me. And then they started to touch my private parts. I said, don't do this to me. Don't do what you don't want to do to your mothers and your sisters. But they were laughing at me, and they were telling me indecent words. And I said, oh my God, my goodness, I never thought that such a thing could be done to a 60-year-old woman like me. So I said, what could we expect? If they do this to me, they could do that to anybody else. I was that old, they did that to me. How much more with all the others? So I said, I must do something. I must tell them I am protesting against what they are doing to me. I made my hunger strike. For 12 days, I did not eat. I just drank and drank water. And maybe they heard it. They heard it. They heard what I was trying to say. And so they brought me, maybe they were afraid I might die. They brought me to a regular detention center. There I saw my charges. I was charged with rebellion. After a few days, I was charged with another rebellion charge. After a few days, I was charged with double murder, double attempted murder, and arson. For 6 years, I was in jail. And it was terrible. Anyway, after 6 years, I was dismissed of all my charges. Dismissed. Meaning to say, they could not find any case against me. No evidences against me. So I said, imagine, no, after all the 6 years, now I am free. I'm happy, I'm free, but I am disgusted of all these things. So I went to the Department of Justice and said, you must indemnify me for all these things that you've done to me. And then they told me, no, you have not been convicted, so you will not be indemnified. What will I do now? I said, I must work for the release of other political prisoners, because they too must experience justice, because no political prisoners should be in jail because they have worked with all their hearts and their minds. They have worked for the good of our country. But you see, our case, the case of Mary, is just a microcosm of really what is happening in our country today. The human rights violations, as what Mary has already said, continues. The time of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, there was a lot. But you might think that, well, it is the new government now. You have the new president. He is the son of the democracy icons. Aquino, the two Aquinos, the mother and the father. So he is expected to have. In fact, many people think that he is that good already. There's no more violations in the Philippines. But we're sorry to say that human rights violations in the Philippines continue. In fact, as he has said, many extrajudicial killings happens, disappearances happens, torture happens, and all these violations. Maybe you have heard about the Maguindanao massacre. The pictures there showed you that. There were lawyers, there were journalists who were killed. And many, 58 people in one instance massacred. We went also to politicians like the members of parliament here, and we have asked them to do something, pressure our government to do something of these violations going on. And we even invited them that maybe they could do something, they could go to the Philippines to really see for themselves what's really happening on the ground. Because reports are very nice. And the Philippine government makes very nice reports. But that is different. We want that they will see for themselves. It will be good if the Filipino communities, Canadian communities, will push them. Especially now because there are these mining companies. That's another problem we have. We have mining companies, and there are many Canadian companies that are really devastating our land with their open pit mining, and they are employing paramilitary forces to help them. And the paramilitary forces trained by the military and provided with arms. And the multinationals, these Canadian companies, they are giving them, of course, the money so that they will stay there. But what the violations they have done to the indigenous people and to the environment, they have devastated, plundered the environment. And we do not even get much from that. No. We only get the tailings, we only get the pollutions, we only get the plunder and the devastation. That is what we get. And they think that they have given us so much. So I think the Canadian people, I think you will be interested in this because you have to tell your government also to do something about what has been done. You know, the Canadian government is aiding us in terms of the Philippine government. The bilateral relations, they are aiding the military in terms of training them in human rights. But I will have to tell you that Amnesty International, in the handbook that they have found, they have quoted this thing that they had in the handbook of the human rights that they make. The handbook states, it is imperative that soldiers are conversant with the human rights standards in order to survive the ordeals of investigation in cases when he becomes involved in a human right violation. So it is, and you know, it is not to stop the violation, but it is to be conversant so that they can evade all these human rights violations. So I think you have to ask your government, what are we doing there? What kind of training are we giving? I think we can do something like, for example, if we can only make efforts to pressure the government to release the 347 political prisoners in our country, that will be very good. You know, because they were released because of international pressures. You know, what about the 347 who are still in jail? Evacuations happens when, let's say, recently, there is this fight between the army and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And there were many army soldiers who were killed because they entered the Islamic Liberation Front said they entered into their territory. But you know what the retaliation was? They bombed communities. They bombed communities, huh? So about 30,000 people evacuated from that whole town. That's one cause of evacuation. Another cause of evacuation is, let's say, mining. They would enter, like now what is happening in one of the areas in Zamboanga. They want to enter, they clear the area, then there are small-scale miners in that area. So they employ these paramilitary forces and drive the residents away. There will be a universal periodic review in May and June. I think the Canadian government could push the Philippine government through the United Nations that the 2008 recommendations should be followed, and new recommendations should be followed by the Philippine government in terms of human rights violations. No, that's one. Another one would be on this, as we were saying, delegations could go there and really look into what's happening, especially in these mining industries, that these mining companies are there and doing the violations happening. I think that would be one very good thing to do, and then from there you could really see on the ground that this is happening, and then do something about these things, that these companies should be answerable. And in fact, there are some places that said you must get out of our country, and if that should be, that should be.
Canada is funding human rights trainings for the armed forces and the police, but it's not being done right. So that's something that could be a focus on. The second is the one Canada has committed to help in the judicial reforms, and maybe that's another area that we could actually look into. I mean, as was mentioned a while ago, this is Canadian taxpayers' money, and it is our business to know where our money is going and how it's being spent. On that note, I just made some comment on divisiveness, because you probably heard about that last report about funding given to NGOs and actually some First Nation groups to go to the Philippines to say that mining is good, right? And if that happens here in Canada, it's also happening in the Philippines. So it's a divide and conquer tactic that has always been there for years, and something that we really have to cope. And that results into these groups too, right? And which is sad, but it's a reality. And so thank you very much for everyone coming.